On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation and our partners at PM Press, I'd like to welcome you to session 4 of Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. This final session of the day is called Final Programs and New Fixes, a conversation with Michael Moorcock. It will feature Mike Stax in conversation with him. As with the previous session, due to difficulties presented by time zone differences, we had to pre-record this event to accommodate everybody. So it was recorded on Friday, February the 11th of 2022. A few words about our participants. To those familiar with the sci-fi genre, Michael Moorcock needs very little introduction. He is considered one of the leading voices of the genres of science fiction and fantasy. He has also published a number of well-received literary novels, as well as comic thrillers, graphic novels, and nonfiction. He has worked as an editor and also as a successful musician. He is best known for his novels about the character Elric of Melniboné, a seminal influence on the field of fantasy since the 60s and 70s. As editor of the British science fiction magazine New Worlds, Mr. Moorcock fostered the development of science fiction's new wave in the UK and indirectly in the United States, leading to the advent of cyberpunk. His publication of Bugjack Baron by Norman Spidrad as a serial novel was notorious. Actually, in British Parliament, some British MPs condemned the Art Council for funding the magazine. So Mr. Moorcock is also a recording musician. He's contributed to bands like Hawkwind, Blue Oyster Cult, Spirits Burning, and his own project, Michael Moorcock and the Deep Fix. In 2008, the Times named Mr. Moorcock in its list of the 50 greatest British writers. So his interviewer today is none other than Mike Stax. Mike Stax is a writer, editor, publisher, record producer, and musician. He is the founder and editor of the legendary Ugly Things magazine and frontman for the musical group The Loons. His work with Ugly Things has been instrumental in the preservation of late 20th century garage, psychedelic, punk, and alternative music. He is currently working as co-writer with Rick Brown on a feature film about the seminal 60s psychedelic rock group, The Misunderstood. So before we begin, I'd like to remind you, we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Dangerous Visions and books by all the rest of our authors. So in a moment, we will begin the broadcast.
Hi, I'm Mike Stax, and today I'm going to be talking to the great, prolific British writer, Michael Moorcock, a huge presence in the world of literature, specifically science fiction literature, since the 1960s. And as such, he's also one of the major figures documented in the book we're covering today. This one, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Science Fiction, 1950 to 1985. So let's get started. Nice to be with you, Michael, or from a distance
nice
at least.
To be with you. Yeah.
Let's start off with at the beginning. How did you first discover science fiction?
Edgar Rice Burroughs. My father, who ran off as soon as the war was over, left behind, actually, by far the best inheritance I could ever have had, which was a couple of Edgar Rice Burroughs books and a couple of other books, George Bernard Shaw and somebody else. So that's how, I mean, I learned to read on the book that he got as a Sunday school prize, which is called Timothy Tatters. And it was about the Irish Land League and how bad it was because it was a Methodist. That's something I don't know. Anyway, but I read it through, and that was, I remember thinking, you know, I've got to read a long book. I want to be able to read a long book. This is before I went to school. So I read that, which was sort of trash. Then I read the Edgar Rice Burroughs. So that was really imprinted on me from about the age of 4 or 5, whenever it was.
Yeah.
So that was when I started reading, you know, as it were, fantastic fiction. And then I got a taste for pulp magazines, for American pulp magazines, which were super, you know, I still love them. But what happened in the old days with science fiction is that there was a drop-off point in readers, usually around college age, say 18, 21, sort of in that age, they slowly stopped reading science fiction. And it happened to me, exactly the same thing happened to me. I just stopped being interested in it. I was a working journalist, and I just had a lot of other things I was doing and other ambitions. But I was in a pub with Ted Carnell, the editor of 3 of the British science fiction magazines then. And he was just feeling nostalgic. And he said, it would be good if we could have one of those old, like Robert E. Howard type stories in the magazine. So I did him one. I did him one just as I might have done an article on Mount Everest, as it were.
Yeah.
And they were popular. They proved popular. So after that, that's how that's how the whole thing started. Getting into science fiction wasn't a problem. Getting out of science fiction was slightly more of a problem.
Do you think science fiction, to readers of your age in the UK, do you think they had a different take from readers in America?
To a degree, it's true. It was more intense for one thing. What you found, I was on the blues scene at one point, right? What you found that everybody on that scene was also reading science fiction. And as it happened, a lot of them were reading me. So I immediately had a sort of entry into that world, as it were. I mean, I didn't have to kind of do anything. I just knew the people who were musicians at the time. Yeah. So, and that's essentially, I mean, I had been a musician. I mean, I'd played skiffle and stuff, which had all done. I'd done a bit of other stuff, but I'd sort of given that up. I mean, I had kids, and I was working. I couldn't do both. But they both had the same appeal. Rock and roll and science fiction was sort of marginal outlaw fiction, if you like. I mean, it's romantic to call it outlaw fiction because it was selling on W.H. Smith and EMI and so on. But nonetheless, it was seen as our fiction, and the music was seen as our music. It was something we had that the adults didn't have. Yeah. There was nobody looking over your shoulder. There were no critics. There were no sort of serious critics. I mean, there was occasionally a mention in the Melody Maker of Elvis Presley in a cartoon, and that was it. I mean, it was a jazz paper then, or any music paper of popular music was pretty much a jazz paper. Before none of the teeny music magazines had come in. There really wasn't anything. There was nobody sort of breathing over you and saying, "Oh, what you doing there then? Well, that's good." They just didn't have any interest in it because they didn't know anything about it. So we really, this was about mid-50s, and skiffle and so on. Slowly, that as we learnt more, at least some of us, as we learnt more about the music, because we couldn't source it very easily, we began to gravitate towards the great blues players. I mean, that was fundamentally it. Yeah. And in my case, also Woody Guthrie. I corresponded with Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger when they were under house arrest under the Un-American Activities Committee. I mean, that's really how weird things were when I started. That was still running.
You could write to somebody like Woody Guthrie and actually have a correspondence.
Oh yeah.
Amazing.
And also, they were the anti-communist stuff was still going. McCarthyism was still alive. So it was a strange, the one place that attacked McCarthyism or that sort of thing was science fiction. Again, most of the New York writers were commies of some kind at that point. Yeah. Trotz or one of them remained a Stalinist to the end of his days. And I can't really say his name, but he was a great editor. But he loved Stalin. Anyway, so they were already of the left, and they used science fiction quite often. People like Pohl and Kornbach and Bester, who were also rather more sophisticated than the average American science fiction writer, because they're usually somewhere stuck in Ohio somewhere, as it were, and couldn't couldn't easily get out. So I've lost my thread, I'm sorry, but that's what I think about it.
Oh, you were talking about Woody Guthrie and just sort of you guys being like the outlaws and identifying with these leftist musicians, leftist science fiction writers.
Yeah. And that was the sort of melange, that was the culture we were in anyway, or I was in anyway, because I was very, I mean, my idea usually was, luckily we were able to meet a lot of those blues guys, because John Brunner, who was another science fiction writer, was a great host to visiting folk musicians, really. I mean, and the blues people were first coming over as folk musicians. I mean, that was the sort of way they were sold.
Big Bill Brunsey and so on, yeah.
John being in that, he's the guy who wrote Don't You Hear the H-Bomb's Thunder, the anti-bomb march. John was a great leftist, and anyway, and that was also associated, quite closely associated. Politics was pretty much of the left. Most of the people were of the left who were involved. So we were already kind of attacking that kind of thing, McCarthyism and so on, in the science fiction magazines. By the 60s, some of us had grown tired of the tropes and of the genre, which tended, tropes always will, to have the reader read a certain way. I mean, it's just, the medium is the message and all of that. And we were interested in that as well. I mean, the whole idea of the medium being the message, or at least part of the message.
Yeah.
So that's really how we started changing it. It wasn't the same as the American new wave. We didn't call it the new wave. Nobody did. Just who really first called it.
Yeah. So once they put a name on it, you don't want to put a name on your own movement. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about New Worlds, because it's covered a lot in the book and very important. And you took over as editor, I think, in 1964.
Yeah.
So you recognize science fiction was changing in the 60s, as you just said, becoming more sophisticated, more experimental, right?
Well, no. I'm sorry, I have to, that's not so. We were very much in opposition to almost all of the science fiction writers. It had become moribund by then. As I say, it really wasn't working anymore. It didn't have any function, really. It wasn't attacking much, or when it did, the American magazines and the American book publishers censored it, simply. I mean, there was no question of it. When Ballard did the Atrocity exhibition, which was we first did in New Worlds, with no trouble whatsoever. Doubleday pulped the first edition under the orders of a guy who was a friend of Kennedy's, had been a friend of Kennedy's and was a friend of his wife. I can't remember her name, Mrs. Kennedy. And
Jackie Kennedy.
Jackie Kennedy, that's right. And of course, Ballard makes a lot of modern figures. It's part of the whole framework, and he didn't like it. So the whole thing was pulped. And if you got the first edition of that in America, you've got a very rare book. A few were sent out. So I mean, it was America seemed to us still very conservative. It was. I mean, it was very weird, America. It went from black and white to color in about a year. This often happens in the States, as you probably noticed. It's very old-fashioned in some ways, and you think, where's this? Where's that? Where's that bit of gear? Such stuff. And then suddenly, everybody's got it. Suddenly there. It was the same. Video recorders were like that. People were very slow to pick up on video recorders in the States. Everybody in Europe had them. And then suddenly, so one year nobody had a video recorder. Next year everybody had one. When you next went back to the States, that was in Europe. Yeah. It's a very strange thing. But anyway, at that point, it was we weren't very interested. We weren't very focused on American science fiction. It seemed stale. The major writers were very conservative by that time. Heinlein was, on the verge of some form of fascism. I mean, I'm not being mean, but and I don't want to attack him really, but he was very far to the right. The only one who wasn't was Asimov, who was sort of vaguely leftish, as it were. But a lot of them were extremely conservative and pro the Vietnam War and all kinds of stuff. When we tried to put an ad in, when I was one of the first members of the Science Fiction Writers of America, the organization, which was formed by those left-wing people, but was quickly diluted by the people who joined it. So it ceased to be, in my view. I left it sometime afterwards. I'm back in now because I got back in because I got a Life Achievement Award, and that gives you a membership. So I was back in anyway.
Whether you like it or not.
Whether I like it or not. And now it's thousands and thousands of people. But at that point, it was about 30 people, probably 40. Wow. And we thought we'd put an ad in the science fiction magazine saying, we, the Science Fiction Writers of America, are against the war in Vietnam, as it were, and feel that, run it down as soon as possible, get out, all that stuff. And we found that half our members disagreed quite violently with that. And we just expected everybody to agree with it, or maybe one or two people, but a whole lot of people, and some of them quite surprising, I must say, came out for the war. So the ridiculous thing happened, again typical in America. A compromise was reached rather than just dropping the idea, and two ads were put in, one supporting the war and one against the war.
Oh, no.
That was a waste of paper. But anyway, there you go.
So it seems like you were taking inspiration from sort of the more fringe elements of the science fiction in America.
Yeah,
and
we were really, Ballard and I, we were close friends. There were only three people at that point who were really wanting it to change. It was me, Ballard, and a guy called Barry Bailey, who's very, 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 not very well known, but extremely influential on the cyberpunk movement.
Yeah.
And a very, very good writer, but very, well, no, he's not a good writer, actually. Very good ideas, but actually not a very good writer. So his stuff's a bit leaden sometimes, but his ideas are brilliant, and that's what that's what people read him for. That's why and he was a great guy. We were partners. We were actually writing partners as journalists for quite a long time. Anyway, so Ballard, Bailey, and I, we were all working in publishing of one sort or another. Jimmy was working for Chemistry and Industry, and I was freelance, and Barry was freelance, mostly doing features, just general features, not on anything in particular. Although I became, anyway, it doesn't matter. And there we were, and the rest, everything else seemed not that good. Jimmy had lost his respect for Bradbury. Bradbury, as who brought him into science fiction.
Yeah.
He then read an article in Life magazine about Bradbury, his hero, and discovered that Bradbury had loads of nerdy little figures, all the stuff that nerds have. I have them, and his respect for Bradbury just vanished. Couldn't take it. Our interest was, and this isn't being snotty, it's just our enthusiasms. We were only young. I mean, these were enthusiasms. Were the French absurdists, the existentialists. Mine in particular was Furbank, another absurdist. It goes back to Peacock in the 19th century. He was an absurdist. It's largely the influences were absurdism of some sort or other. Even Mervyn Peake, who did a lot of absurd verse and writing.
Yeah.
We thought that what was happening was that the rationalizations that people were giving were getting in the way of the ideas, were getting in the way of the actual imaginative inspiration. So there was a lot of, how does this thing work? Exposition within science fiction stories, and we wanted to dump all that. We just wanted to get rid of it. It was a waste of time. I didn't care how a spaceship got you to Jupiter, or or whether you could breathe air or not when you got there. I mean, I just wasn't interested. And we had a vague sort of, we were kind of saying, cheering on the guys who were going up on the moon and stuff like that, but we weren't really interested. And I certainly wasn't. I mean, I had no interest in space whatsoever. It was just a setting. I didn't know. I still don't know where Arcturus 5 is. I mean, I've no idea where these places are. But science fiction had two things. It was popular. Well, more than two things. It was popular. It had an intellectual base. It appealed to people's minds quite as much as it appealed to their visual imagination. So you had all the things you really needed, if you like, in a literary movement. The substance of it was there. The pop artists, who we soon became allied to, were doing the same thing. The first pop art, as you know, the pop art movement started in England with Palazzi and Hamilton and so on, and their first exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery was called "This Is Tomorrow," and it was an outside. I happened to be working in the area, and I actually saw the exhibition. I mean, I knew nothing about it as a kid, but there it was. I went in, and they had a big robot outside, which of course attracted me as a kid. Robbie the robot from Forbidden Planet, and a big cutout. And inside were people like Palazzi and Hamilton, all of them deeply interested in science fiction. But for the imagery, they weren't really interested how, or where it was going on. They were just the images that were important.
Yeah.
And that was true too of, a lot of the French writers I've mentioned. Well, I didn't mention, but Jarry and Guin and people like that. And the movies that we were watching, which were New Wave, actually Nouvelle Vague movies, all had that slightly fantastic turn to them, that turn of imagination. And we could see just a whole arsenal of stuff there that wasn't being used by anybody really. I mean, not in the general culture.
Yeah.
It was, as it were, marginalized. I'm not saying we were sort of too posh and looked down on it in any way. We're enthusiasts, but we could see what we could do with it. We didn't want to be restricted by the commercial aspects of science fiction, which had become very, very important by that time. I mean, when Wells wrote The Time Machine for the Fortnightly, was it the Fortnight? Anyway, I've actually got it, the magazine. Anyway, when he wrote it for the magazine, I mean, he wasn't writing for a science fiction magazine, he was writing for a general magazine, and that's the context I wanted to see the stuff in. I wanted to see that happen. And what inspired me, or rather sort of cheered us on in a way, was the Beatles' success. It was the Beatles that drove almost everything at that point. I mean, they were the center, and the vitality, as it were, of ideas was being given authority by the fact that they were making a lot of money. As not authority, I mean, they had their own authority, but as far as the press was concerned, I suppose, that sort of impressed them, which meant that it filtered through to a lot of other arts, including, of course, music. It meant that you could do more because they didn't know anymore what sold.
Yeah. They were doing.
I mean, sort of, and or even Where's Elvis Presley? This was music. Music was being made. Almost as you listened, they were progressing, sort of almost hourly. I mean, it was astonishing how they developed a genuine musical sensibility. I mean, once they had George Martin's as a sort of mechanic, as it were, who could put what they wanted to do into reality. And he was an important part of that, of course. Once they had that, I mean, there seemed to be no stopping them. I mean, they did stop. They went back and looked again at their origins. They did that quite a bit. One does that, I think, when working. I do that when I'm working. I look at the origins, and I want to see what was really doing it for me. I don't want any of the crap. I don't want a load of strings, even though Buddy Holly did use them, you know, and all of that. So without the Beatles, we wouldn't have had the authority to do what we did, I suspect. Many of us wouldn't have had that authority, unless we'd gone into fine arts like the pop artists. And we didn't want to go into the fine arts. We wanted to sell on the newsstands because that's where science fiction sold. We wanted to get directly to real people rather than go through the critics, which is the normal way of becoming, as it were, popular.
Right, and yeah, the Beatles really showed that because they were completely self-contained. They wrote the songs, played all the instruments. They didn't need professional experts like in the past, producers, songwriters. They did it all, and they were just ordinary working class people, not even from London. They're completely outside the mainstream.
Absolutely, and I tell you, Apple was horrible when they started giving money away. It was just a nightmare, and I just put this on my Facebook page. I mean, it's just a thing I remembered. I was at Apple, and Derek Taylor had said he wanted to give New Wells some money, right? Because they were giving away money. So I went there with Bill Harry, who was my friend who'd another connection, actually. He'd been in Liverpool. He was at Liverpool School of Art. He'd been my art editor, as it were, on fanzines that I did. So we went back to school age, as it were. So Bill knew the Beatles and knew all the guys, and and had become a publicist, I think, by this time. He was that, that's. So I was getting to meet these people partly through that. I mean, through Bill, who's still alive. I mean, he's retired, but he's still alive out there, still rocking and rolling. And so as we came through Apple, you went up it had only been open about 3 weeks. You went up an apple green staircase, the stair carpet was apple green. It was worn to a nub. I mean, it was just worn. The number of feet that have been up it was just astonishing. You then
free money,
You then went into the first sort of chamber, a large sort of Georgian, it was a house, as you know, big room, and it was filled with hippies, as it were. It was just absolutely just filled with people waiting to see Derek, who was the first step towards getting Apple money. So you went through that. You then went through a second room. I mean, this was like a court. I mean, it operated. It's how it functioned. No other way of it functioning. And these were the guys who got through to the second room, and they were all there, ready to make a recording to warn people about the guys from Mars or whatever it was they were doing. And there was some extremely strong. The only person I think who came out of that was James Taylor. He recorded Apple. But anyway, and after, and I'm just talking, and there'd been something about the Beatles to go bankrupt. It was just a headline, they couldn't go bankrupt. It was almost impossible. I mean, the money was just, it just kept coming in. And George Harrison was there, and I didn't know George Harrison. And Derek says, "Oh, George, this is Mike Moorcock." He doesn't, because I'd said to Derek, "Sorry, I don't want any money from you. I just don't." I said, "Buy some advertising, buy something, but I really don't want any money from you. I can't stand it." These guys, whose talent that got them, pure talent that got them there, and we're giving this money away because I know how that feels. You feel guilty. You don't want to be separated from your own people. You're trying to just get rid of it, and it's a strange thing. It's happened to me several times in my up and down career. You just can't help it. You don't want it because it puts such a barrier between you and what you came out of, and you need what you came out of. So anyway, so Derek says, "Hi, hi, George." George was full of his new little Instamatic. He got rid of all his thousands of Leicas and all the rest of it, and he got himself in this thing and said, "It's amazing, you don't have to do anything." And anyway, Derek says, this is Mike Moorcock. He doesn't want any money from us. And as I said on Facebook, I've never had my hand more warmly shaken. It was like he was, oh, thank you. I didn't want anything from them. I mean, they were giving me far more than I could possibly, ever want. So I was, I was a big Beatles fan. That's really what got me also back into, I suppose, popular music, rock and roll, and so on. Because I started listening to it again, and it became interesting. It wasn't just the Beatles. There were a few. I mean, I'm not a great rock and roll fan, but the Who were doing interesting stuff musically. The Kinks were doing stuff. There were a lot of bands, big bands that were actually very experimental, or fairly experimental musically, and doing interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Generally, I wasn't, until Hawkwind came along, I wasn't much involved with music. I just slowly slid out of, performing, because it didn't pay anything anyway, and it was very uncomfortable, because the back of a Ford Transit all the way to Doncaster isn't necessarily the best way you want to spend your time.
Well, but tell me a little bit about, your band was called the Deep Fix, even as early as '64 or so, right?
Yes.
Were you sort of part of that whole British R&B scene? You in the Cornelius Chronicles, you mentioned like Zoot Money, the Downliner Sect, you name-checked these very cool bands from back then. Were you a part of that sort of sphere of musicians?
I suppose I was. I mean, I wasn't performing at all, but I was in the Flamingo, virtually every night for a long time. Certain nights not, because they're sort of pop nights, which anyway. The Flamingo was really, when I say it's about three of us, center. It's where all the best R&B bands played sooner or later. They were always going to have a London gig, or well, of course they played at the Railway as well in West Hampstead. Yeah. But that was too far for me. It was too far out. I mean, it was ridiculous. I remember Jimmy Ballard when I moved to Fulham. We came from Yorkshire to Fulham. I didn't want to live in Fulham, but we couldn't afford anywhere else at the time. And Jimmy Ballard said, "Oh, glad you're back, Mike. You must come down to the suburbs and have a drink." And I said, "Jimmy, I'm living in the suburbs. You're living in the country." It was horrifying to me. I wasn't, I was used to being able to walk quarter an hour and get home from a gig, as it were.
Yeah.
It did bring me close to Hampstead. So not Hampstead, Hammersmith. So I did do more gigs in Hammersmith. I was very lazy. I didn't like the discomfort, and I didn't like the tensions of band life, which come about. Just they do, but they were distracting, and I didn't like them much. So I really didn't do an awful lot of gigging. I love being on stage. I love entertaining. I mean, I'll do that for hours. You can't keep me off the stage, but I don't like, because I like doing it for. I've never earned a penny from Hawkwind, put it that way. I never got paid for a gig. I never wanted to get paid for a gig. I didn't even get my session fee for something I did. I doubt about that, No, I can't say I've ever had any money out of Hawkwind. Most people haven't, but that's another story. But so I do it, entirely for the pleasure of it. And that audience, to me, is my people. I know that, I know a lot of posh people. I know a lot of people who can't understand why I do this. A lot of people who just wish I wouldn't. People who think, if only I didn't do that, I'd be so much more successful or better known, more on the, and all that. I don't want to. It's as simple as that. I'm perfectly happy doing what I do. I wouldn't mind sometimes a bit more dosh, but I'm not. I'm rich by almost any standards locally here. I mean, when you see how most people, there's a lot of poor people living in what are essentially, in motorhomes and stuff like that. Yeah. And you can't live in Texas and not self-tithe because they don't tax. There's no income tax in Texas, because if you didn't, you just couldn't live here. I mean, as a person of conscience, it wouldn't be possible to do. People come here to evade taxes. We didn't come here for that reason. We came here largely because there were people in Austin, musicians and writers, who were very lively at the time, were very lively at the time. Yeah. Some of them are dead now. I mean, Mac McLaren, for instance, is a great guy, from the Faces, right, came here, and quite a few other people. Anyway, a lot of English people came to Austin for reasons, not just because they were going to be famous in a small town, which a lot of, as you probably know, English people do. It's a tendency. Yeah. So I didn't want any of that. And performing with Hawkwind was the best way I had of getting, as it were, back in touch with readers, because a lot of those readers, a lot of the Hawkwind fans are like anybody else. They're not particularly interested in anything except the music. They don't want to know anything else. They don't read anything. They're not readers. They're music people. That's what they like. That's their enthusiasm. And it keeps you sort of real too, if you know what I mean, because not everybody loves you. They do when you're on stage with Hawkwind. I mean, there's no question of that. It's just natural. I mean, it was strange how, I know I'm rambling. I'm not sort of following your narrative very well.
No, that's fine. That's fine. It's all fascinating.
When punk came in the, let's say, late 70s or mid to late 70s, Hawkwind and Lemmy and Motorhead at that time, by that time, were the only bands that what's John's name?
John Peel?
Lyman.
John Peel?
No, not John Peel. No, this is a Sex Pistols guy.
Oh, John Lydon.
John Lydon, yeah. Who I didn't know actually, but I knew. What's his guitarist? Oh Christ! I'm terrible at names.
Steve Jones.
No, it's the other one. The one who left. Who they all, well, not all, but John studied.
Glenn Matlock.
Glenn was a really nice guy, sweet guy. I don't know if you know him, but he is a very nice guy. So anyway, Hawkwind and Motorhead people were the only people the punks respected. You could go anywhere to a punk gig, and if they knew who you were. And by that time I was 40, by say 1980, when sort of stuff was, I suppose, at its height. I was in my late 30s, and I remember when Linda and I went to a gig. I can't remember. I think it was at the Music Machine in Camden. I can't even remember the gig, but anyway. Oh, I know, because a friend of mine was managing the adverts. I don't know if you remember the adverts.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and I like the adverts. Gay was a sweet kid. They were all very sweet, actually, very nice. And so we were going to the adverts gig. Once we got there, all these punks, guys with huge stuff and, or shaven heads or whatever, the punk stuff, are coming up to us and saying, "Can we get you anything? Would you like a chair?" And, and so on. I mean, we were there, we were respected, but we were seen as very old. It was very nice, really. It was a nice transition because there was no difference between punk, hippies and punks. I mean, it's just a different hairstyle, really. The people who had the idealism and kept the idealism, they did. Everybody else did whatever normally happens. Some of them became totally commercialized, and some of them didn't.
But a lot of them came out of that same sort of scene as like you say, Hawkwind, the Pink Fairies, the Deviants, Edgar Broughton. It was kind of, that was sort of street music from the spots of London and what have you. So
absolutely,
it really was no different.
No, it wasn't. And I mean, and those the people you mentioned, of course, the people that I knew. I wasn't really moving in the pop world. I mean, except wherever it kind of impinged on something else I was doing. When I say pop, I mean Iggy Pop, actually, when I think of it. I had to carry Iggy one time from we were staying at the same hotel, and he gets in drunk. I mean, he's just out of it. You know how nice he is. I mean, he's really nice guy, and he says, he thinks he knows me, and he doesn't really. I mean, we passed in the night, as it were. He starts talking, and then he slowly sinks to the floor of the elevator. I mean, he just passes out. So I pick him up because he's not that big, and take him to the bar. Actually, is where we were both going, and I just propped him up and left him there to go and drink it. I suppose. but I didn't really. I knew a lot of famous people before they were famous, but I didn't really get into the kind of big time music scene at all. I wasn't that interested in it.
You don't seem to be somebody who'd be impressed with celebrity.
I suppose that's it. I mean, Bill, for instance, as a publicist, one time he got the Pink Floyd and he got me together, and here we are. To be honest, I didn't at that time much like Pink Floyd's, the little Pink Floyd I'd heard, but I didn't mind. I mean, it wasn't. They're perfectly all right blokes, you know. And for 2 days, we were taken around every bloody electronic music studio. It seemed to me on Earth. It was actually only in the London region, but it was. And we just sat there while they played electronic music at us. We went sort of, okay. And we still don't know why we're all there. We went for 2 days doing that, and then vaguely we just sort of faded away. I mean, we didn't do anything at all. I know that Sid Barrett had read a book of mine. I mean, I hadn't got that many books out then, or not as many as now, called The Fire Clown. I think it was The Fire Clown. It may have been which he did, which set the controls for The Heart of the Sun is supposed to be inspired by.
Right.
But I mean, there's a lot of that because, again, science fiction and rock and roll in England were just pretty much like that. They were almost interchangeable. The strange thing was that all of the musicians were friendly and pleasant to the science fiction writers. The science fiction writers were so fucking straight that they were always uncomfortable. I mean, it was just amazing. Brian Aldiss, who is one of my best friends, and I love dearly. I mean, he's a nice guy. Did a very good book called Barefoot in the Head, which was one of the books mentioned in the book, which was experimental in language and had a lot to do with acid and so on. But he didn't really know anything about it. It was research from Brian. I mean, he was, like most of them, they were drinkers. They weren't druggers, and they looked down on druggers as they got drugged a different way. I remember Brian said, could you introduce me to a rock and roll band, because I'd like them to look at my lyrics and see if they could turn them into songs. So I said, sure. And I mean, genuinely, I was, all right, if that's what you want to do. The band that I introduced them to, at least not all of them, were the Pink Fairies. But I mean, these are the people I knew. I didn't know the Beatles, I didn't know these people. These weren't, I didn't socialize with any of these people. These are the people I socialized with. And so we're all sitting on a mattress, every one of us except Brian, stoned out of our brains, while the girl that he has been trying to pick up all evening is trying to pick me up, which I wasn't. I had kids, I was married, and they were around the corner too, so I wasn't exactly. So it was just, and afterwards he'd lost his wallet he went mad. He accused my friends of being, you know, thieves and rogues of the. It's astonishing. He'd lost his wallet. Dave Brock brought it round the next day. He said, Blackie, you know, Paul Rudolph was one of the people. Blackie found this, and you know, and he thought he knew Brian Aldiss was a mate of yours, and here it is. And of course, all the money was gone, but all his credit cards and everything were there, you know. And I said, in the meantime, he'd accused me of all kinds of things. I mean, the reaction these friends of mine were having to these other friends of mine was really very, very strange. I mean, I couldn't see it. They were all, I mean, they were just welcoming, friendly to the SF people. The SF people really, my generation was better. I mean, you know, I'm not saying, you know, but I was younger than pretty much anybody else of my, you know, level of fame or whatever it was. I mean, I was just the younger of that generation. But they all saw me as being, you know, as really going downhill, really not helping myself with all this hippie nonsense.
I guess now would be an opportune time to talk about Mick Farren, who I wrote a chapter about in the book. And
yeah,
obviously, thank you. Obviously, you were moving in the same circles as him.
Yeah.
Was he like a kindred spirit? Were you rivals?
Not at
friends?
first. Not at first. At first, Mick was very wary of me because he couldn't work out. You know, I was. You know, he hadn't written anything at that point, and I, of course, was the hippie's favorite writer at that point. Yeah. So here I am. I don't think of myself, you know, I just don't. It's very hard for me to think of myself as being, you know, famous or anything like that. So I was all right with it, but Mick was very kind of, what's he up to? What's he doing here? What's he after? You know, and it wasn't until, I suppose it was the second Oz trial, the trial of the people demonstrating outside for Oz, which convinced him that I was on the right side, because I was involved in that, and I made sure people got to court, and you know, I was the only one actually with a normal life of any sort, I suppose. But I could organise a taxi, and I could, you know, wake people up and get them, you know, there before they were again, you know, summoned or whatever it was. I mean, this is just what was happening. And witnessed some extremely prejudiced stuff. I mean, just astonishing. It was the City of London magistrates, and they're notoriously terrible, as are the cops there. So it wasn't a fair trial by any means, but nonetheless, we did our best to, you know, to make it work. And I think I've got one person sort of away from any serious charge. The lawyers who started off as being very cynical about us, when they looked at the evidence, which luckily we had a lot of photographers around at that time. I mean, you know, hippie photographers, they were everywhere. Everybody wanted to be in the underground papers. You know. And so we had photographs. We could prove that the police were lying. It didn't stop the magistrates, by the way. They just dismissed the evidence. But nonetheless, that's what probably what convinced Mick that I wasn't just some kind of slummer come to see what the hippies were like. I mean, I looked like them. I looked more like them than they did. I mean, I always had, as it were, to a degree. Although I went from mod to that. I mean, I didn't think of myself as a mod. As I said to my kids who described me as a mod, I said, I didn't say I was a mod. We just all dressed like that at that time. You know, we had little thin black ties and, you know, white shirts. And that's how we dressed. I mean, it was sort of, you know, how we did it. And, well, apparently I was a mod, so now I can say I was a mod. I didn't have a Vespa. Anyway, ask me a question. I'm rambling. I'm very sorry.
Well, yeah. So that at that point, Mick realised that you were.
Oh yeah, Mick.
One of them or whatever.
I was okay. Yeah, and after that, we got on fine. It was really after IT, so there must have been some IT stuff going on there too. International Times, because I did a strip. I did a strip variety, I think, before I really knew Mick. I mean, I knew him to nod to, as it were, because obviously he was editing International Times and I was contributing. But we did a Jerry Cornelius strip for International Times, and after that, I think probably it wasn't that we were avoiding each other. It's just that we didn't come into each other's spheres at times, and then we did, and then we were fine. We were just mates, you know. After that, I liked him a lot. I was extremely. I had a lot of respect for him. A lot of respect for Mick.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it must have been you to a degree that opened doors for him, even if you didn't literally help him with his career. You must have looked at you and said, a guy like me could write science fiction, you know?
And well, could do something interesting too, you know. He was the only other person, I think, of any, you know, of any substance. I'm not being mean, but who produced more than one book, let's say, who knew the rock and roll world as well as he knew the science fiction world.
Yeah.
Well, he knew the rock and roll world better than he knew the science fiction world, really. But the real rock and roll world, as we used to think of it anyway, in the people's bands. I mean, we were just, you know, that's what we were. And he then moved to Los Angeles. So and not at the same time as I moved to Los Angeles. So I didn't see him for quite a long time. We correspond a bit. Then he moved back to Brighton. I think, didn't he go from LA to Brighton? I don't remember his exact route, but and then he was in Brighton. And again, I didn't see him much because by that time, I think I was in Yorkshire. And, you know, it's just, you know, we just didn't cross paths much. But we were very friendly. I mean, and, you know, I'd have done anything for him. He was a solid bloke. Really?
Yeah, he was great. Can we talk now a little bit about Jerry Cornelius?
Yeah.
You mentioned being a mod, and you know, the original Jerry Cornelius character, you know, as in the first book, he was really part ace-face mod and sort of a part almost James Bond-like secret agent. I mean, he was kind of an embodiment of that era, really. Is that what you had in mind?
Well, you know, as with science fiction, I was trying to find popular imagery, stuff that was, you know, my imagery, as it were, that would work, my experience that would work. I wrote the first one in 10 days in January 1965. I learned to work fast because I had children very young.
I was going to ask you about that because I read you did like 15,000 words a day sometimes.
Yeah.
As a writer, I was like, how is that even possible?
It's possible because I can do over 200 words a minute. I went to Pitman's College. I learned nothing at Pitman's College except how to type. And I am an ace typist. When I was young, I used to hire out as a typist, you know, a temporary typist at offices. When you know, if I was broke, you could go to an agency and they'd give you a job pretty much immediately. Every one of them would ask me to stay on. Yeah, please stay on. Yeah, please stay on, because I could spell and I could do 200 words a minute. I mean, it's sort of
that is incredible.
I was great for them, but not so much for me. So I never really did take up any offer. But that was it. It's just fast typing. I mean, fast accurate typing. I can still hear the music of how we used to learn how to type by music. They used to go da 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 da. Dong. You should return the courage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, typing fast is one thing, but it's, you know, your imagination and your writing moving that fast is a whole other issue.
Well, yeah. Well, it's what I used to call it was. Sorry, I try, you know, you can't teach this, unfortunately. You can teach how to structure so you can write quickly, you know, so that structure helps you write fast because you know what you've got to say and you're not pausing to think, as it were. I've completely forgotten what I was saying.
Well,
It
yeah,
just-
well,
I was just thinking about typewriters. Sorry,
you were saying you wrote the first Cornelius book very quickly.
well, that's right. Yeah. Well, actually, I wrote part of that book with my daughter Sophie on one knee. This is the truth. My daughter Kate on another, with bottles propped. I don't know how I did it. We were living in a two-room flat with a bath in the kitchen, and you had to lift this thing. I was working on the top of the bath with these two kids, and that's how I wrote it. I mean, it was very. I don't believe it now, and my first wife says it's a fantasy, so maybe it's not true. But I remember it very clearly doing it because it was easy for me to stay up late. So I could look after the kids at night. She didn't have to get up because I could work and you know, when the kids needed feeding, I could do that. She didn't have to wake up. And so maybe she just didn't see it. But I know I did it. And I loved it. I love my kids. I mean, a lot of my books, I actually remember, I don't remember anything about the books. I can never remember anything about them. People ask me questions about the books, I can't do it. I'm looking for a Kleenex, and Linda appears to have stolen them. Linda, you stolen my Kleenex. Oh, well. I don't know. What's this? There it goes. I'll blow my nose. Sorry. What were we talking about?
Well, yeah, Jerry Cornelius.
Jerry Cornelius. I actually saw Jerry Cornelius. He's based on a real person. There's a little cafe at the top of where Portobello Road and Kensington Park Road divide. There's just a little kind of V there of shops and restaurants. And this was right at the V of the thing. You could see Notting Hill directly through the window. You could see Notting Hill Tube Station. Behind that was a greengrocer's. I'll get to this in a minute, maybe. And behind that was a greengrocer's. And as I was eating my, whatever it was, chicken chasseur was very good there. It's just a nice little cafe, Italian cafe. I see this guy walking towards me, and I've been thinking about how to deal with the mythology of London, basically. How everything around me actually has a mythic aspect. And I wanted to look at it, you know, and see how I could work it. And this guy is coming towards me through the glass, as it were. He's got a black velvet jacket on. I can't remember his trousers. They were probably just ordinary trousers and stuff. He's got hair as long as yours, which was unusual by that time. And very few people had hair that long then. I mean, we all had long hair, but it wasn't that long.
Yeah.
And it was lovely, sort of chestnut color. Anyway, and he was pretty impressive. Just the image of him, you know, you're just a cool dude. You didn't, you know, he probably wasn't if you talked to him, but he looked great. And behind him was the greengrocer's sign, which said Cornelius of London.
Wow.
And that bloke, I will never know, and could well be dead by now. And the greengrocer, which is no longer there either, were the two sort of images I needed, or name an image that I needed for it. And I pretty much went home and wrote it.
Amazing.
Yeah. I was using spy James Bond type stuff, but I was using science fiction stuff as well, and I was really parodying around the same time. In fact, I wrote 2 parodies of James Bond books, 2 comic spy thrillers where the hero thinks he's James Bond, but is basically a wanker, which I think James Bond is too, but that's my opinion. So I was kind of interested. These are all the kind of, you know, these are the powerful images coming in, pictures of Sean Connery with, you know, with his Beretta or whatever, you know, all that. and also the Black Panther movement. I think may have been a little bit later, when in the second book, I'm not quite sure, but they were glamorous. I mean, those guys, everybody wanted to be one of those guys. I mean, you know, if you could, you would have blacked up, put on a beret, and you got yourself
those leather jackets are really beautiful, right?
I mean, they were the tops and cool. I mean, you couldn't get
there's shades and everything,
shades, the whole thing. I mean, it's such a tragedy what happened. I mean, a terrible tragedy. But they're almost too good. Their image is almost too good for them. You know, it brought them down. But anyway, I mean, it was that sort of thing that I wanted to get into. What I said I wanted to do is I wanted to use hot subject matter, but written in a cool way. I wanted some way of distancing, but it was like today's news. Like I've just finished a COVID story, for instance. I'm not, or at least it refers to COVID. It's a Jerry Cornelius story, but it doesn't actually have anything about COVID in it. But it's up to the reader to make whatever links they want to make, which is what I do. I suppose I'm an egalitarian writer. Or you could say I make the reader do half the work. So really, they should only be paying me half the money. But I don't like to tell them that, because they'll catch on and then it's all over.
Well, I think the readers appreciate that. You know, they don't want you to give. They appreciate you allowing them to use their imaginations too. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely part of it. It's showing a respect for their intellect, I think.
Exactly. Because you see, you know, if they want to read that stuff at the beginning, they're attracted to it. They've got a brain. I mean, they're thinking. Doesn't matter what else, you know, they're thinking people. They can reject what you've got to say, or they can accept it, or do whatever they like with it. But you're dealing with, with a nice, smart group.
The time police are here.
The time police are here.
Well.
I'm sorry, we haven't covered anything that you wanted to cover.
I should have told him that he had to interrupt you if he wanted a word in it.
No, this was perfect, and I think we hit a lot of the key points. The structure actually stayed just about right.
Okay.
And I wanted to end with asking how your methodology had changed, and you sort of went there and kind of told me that it's very much the same in a lot of ways.
In some ways, but I have changed. I had to loosen up, because the thing is, once you've worked out a structure, you start using it too often, it becomes easy, and it means that you're not using it right. It's become moribund in your own hands. So you have a
template,
absolutely. So you just have to do something.
Say goodbye, Michael.
So I've loosened up a lot. I'm much loosened now.
Say goodbye, Michael.
Say goodbye, Michael.
All right, well, Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yes, I enjoyed it too. I'd like to have chatted longer. You look like an interesting bloke. You've obviously got a history. I'd like, anyway,
Well, hopefully we can talk again. I'd love that.
Yeah, great, good. Okay,
thanks very much for your time. And while I'm on camera, I do really want to thank not only you, but also PM Press and City Lights Books for hosting this event. And thank you to everybody who is watching.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.